Okay, so now that we've looked at the hardware of the Form 3, let's get into some details on how to use Preform and how to orient your parts and put supports on them in the best way so that you have the least amount of post-processing in here. Every time you start up Preform, you will be greeted with this window right here for your material selection, layer height, and also what printer you want to use. You can always just get that back up if you click on this Edit button right here. And then on the right side, you will also find this printability feature. We're going to talk about that in more detail in a minute. But the one thing on the right that I also want to go over real quick is this model list, which is actually very useful because with this model list, you can just tick in and out different models, and then you can work on just one or two models in terms of their orientation and supports, and just prepare them for the print, and then you can untick them when you're ready, and then just tick in the next one, work on that one, and go your way through all of your files. The cool thing is also that if you press this orange button on the left side now to send this off to your preferred printer, Preform will only send off the models that are ticked in that model list now. So basically you can also use this if you have a big assembly, for example, of 50, 60, 70 parts that don't really fit the build volume at all. You can still put all of them in Preform, prepare them in terms of their orientation, support, and layout on the build platform, and then you can just take the first, then you basically hide all of them, and then you just tick in the first 10, 15, 20 models or so until the build volume is completely filled. You send that off to the printer, then you hide all of those, and then you just tick in the next 10, 15 models or so that will fit the build volume, send that off again, and then you just go through your whole list of models. The cool thing about this is that if you hit File and then Save or Save As, you will still save this as one preform, one .form file, which is a very cool thing. So you don't have to save your assembly as assembly print1.form, assembly print2.form, or so. You can use the model list for this kind of thing and keep all of those files together, which is actually really cool, I find. Going over to the left side, before we get into all of these tools that I want to show you, I first want to show you one or two things that are on the top here. So one thing that a lot of people find very helpful is that in the view features at the top here, you now have the option to hide your manipulators right there. So if you tick that in or untick that, basically you will not have this globe and these arrows on this model anymore. This can be very helpful if you have a very tiny model. Sometimes if you have in the dental space, for example, if you just have one singular die, for example, or if you're in the jewelry space and you have one singular ring that you want to work on, sometimes these manipulators can hide some of your features that you want to actually put supports on or want to do orientation with. So it's sometimes useful to just go in the view feature and just hide those manipulators. And the other big thing I want to mention is in the help menu actually. And in here, you will have this button that reads keyboard shortcuts. If you go on here, there's going to be a menu that shows you, well, all of the keyboard shortcuts that are in Preform. But there's actually quite a few in here that are very useful. This will be according to your computer, so Mac or Windows. I'm on a Windows computer right now, so it shows me everything with control. Most of these are just with your command key on Mac, but you will see how they're actually used if you open this menu on the Mac. Um, the most important ones I find are just, as always, Control Z and Control Y for going back a step or for redoing a step. And the other one I particularly find very interesting is the Control D option for duplicating single parts. So if I need just two or three of this rook, I can just hit Control D, bloop, 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 and then I have the amount of parts that I need, and then I can press Control Z, for example, as I had way too many right now. This is a very cool feature. And then the other two buttons that I regularly use are page up and page down. I'm going to get into those in a minute though. And then going over those tools on the left side, we have the wand right at the top. So basically what the wand, this one-click print option, what that will do is basically it will go to the orientation feature, click auto orientation, it will go to supports, click auto generate supports, and then it will go to layout and click automatic layout all. So if you have done all of these three things by hand, you will have done the very same thing this wand does. But typically speaking, you want to do at least the orientation yourself. So that's why I personally typically tell people, yeah, the wand is cool for the first few prints that you do, but from that point onward, if you have been doing it for a week or two or so, usually you getting away from the wand and are doing your things just by hand. Um, or if you need it to be set up very, very quickly, then you can also use the wand to just go very fast, one click, done, and just send it off to the printer. Right at the top is the sizing feature. Just one or two very small things to note about here. You can also do that with this arrow right here. I've not encountered that myself, but I've sometimes heard of people sometimes when they push around their models on the build platform, sometimes accidentally clicking on this arrow and then sizing their models up or down. If you are ever worried about your files maybe being scaled because you may be pulled on this arrow, what you can do before you send it off to the printer is just click on these individual models, hit the size feature, and then you will see that this model, for example, is at a 0.743% scale. So I will see that this has been scaled at some point. And if I want to undo that, I just click reset, done. The second small thing I want to note here, just very quickly, is that if you do put in any kind of scale, you're technically not scaling the model itself. What you will always be scaling is this blue frame that sits around your model. So this will basically be the maximum outline of your model. So this will be height or width or depth, for example. What's the difference, you might ask? Well, the difference is very obvious the moment we turn our model at some angle into the build volume. Why we want to do that in the first place, I'm going to show you in a minute. But if I have this rook right here turned on this little angle, if I want to have this rook now be 75 millimeters tall, I can't do that right now, because even if I put in 75 millimeters for the z-axis, which would typically be the height, and hit enter, now it's still this blue line that I technically scaled right here. So my rook right now will be quite a bit taller than 75 millimeters. So if I just put it straight in the build volume and then go back to the sizing feature, you will see that it's not 75 millimeters tall. So remember, if you want to do anything with absolute measurements in here, just always undo your orientation first. That's very important. If you do just 3 times the scale, it doesn't matter if your model is already oriented, because 3 times the scale is always 3 times the scale. Orientation. So just going through this very quickly, as this is super straightforward, you can just go into any of these, orient X, Y, or Z, just put in an angle, for example 15 degrees, hit enter, done. Or you can also use this orientation to bounding box to put the model on its top, bottom, right, left, front, back surfaces basically. If you ever want to put your model straight on the build platform, I would highly recommend using this select base feature right here. Because if you do, your mouse and basically your arrow becomes this little plane with a little orthogonal on it. What you can do with this is you can just click on any planar surface and Preform will put this flat onto the build platform. So this can be a very, very useful feature. So if you're ever unsure if your model is actually straight in its own coordinate system, better use the select base feature rather than this orientation to bounding box. And then there's also a little bit of a hidden feature in here which not a lot of people know about, because what will sometimes happen is that people will now want to turn this rook a little bit sideways, let's say to the right, and they will pull on this ring, and sometimes this goes a bit too quick for some people, myself included. What you can do is you can just hover your mouse over orient X, Y, or Z. You don't have to click in here, you just hover your mouse over it, and then you can scroll your mouse wheel, and then you have this fine rotation right here, which I find is a very, very cool feature to just do this one extra tick, being like, maybe one tick extra, cool, now it's perfect. And this can be a very, very useful tool to use in Preform. So I'm just undoing this right here because I want to show you a couple other things on this rook. I'm just jumping over the support feature right now because I'm going to show you that in a minute. Last thing on this list is the layout feature. This is super straightforward. If you have a lot of parts in here, this can take off quite a lot of work off your hands, where you would just put in, hey, I want all of these at a distance of 0.5 millimeters, for example. And then you just click layout all, and Preform will just push them around on the build platform so that they fit in here. With this, as with all of the other automatic functions, if you're not satisfied with this layout, for example, just click it again. Preform actually has a couple of things that it will play around if it sees that you're clicking this arrow, this feature a couple times. Right now it's not giving me a lot of differences here, but you can still iterate on top of that, maybe by hand, by doing something like this, for example, if that floats your boat. And this is also typically how I would always recommend you be using these individual features, like these automatic functions. Always just give it 1 or 2 clicks and see what Preform does and what Preform recommends you be doing, and then iterate on top of that, because usually also using your noggin will just improve the orientation or the support that you had pre-done by Preform by quite a lot. And then you can also do duplicates in here. This is very useful for engineering in general, but also for the jewelry space, because sometimes you just need 35 of a single ring. Just remember that this is what you put in here is the actual amount of duplicates that you are creating. So if I need 35 rings, I put in 34 because this is the amount that I create, and then I still have that one original, so overall it will be 35. There is one more tool in Preform that is overlooked by a lot of people, and that I have to specifically say for myself that I have to say is by far the most important feature and the most important tool of all of these that are in Preform. And the one feature that I haven't been talking about at all so far is this slider on the right hand side. And I would urge you to be using this slider. I'm not kidding here. Looking at people's dashboards and looking at people's models when they come out of the printer, out of the foam wash, I can see on your model whether or not you have been using the slider or not. I can see it in your print success rate, and I can see it just in the overall print quality of your parts. I urge you to use the slider. This doesn't mean, this slider, by the way, what it does is it will show you all the individual slices of your model, and you can go through these before sending this model off to the printer. Me telling you to use the slider doesn't mean that before every single one of your prints, you're supposed to sit here with every single model and go through it like this, and then waste about 20 minutes on this. If you're getting used to the slider, what you will do at some point, you will tick in 2 or 3 models at the same time, just distribute them on the build platform. You will zoom out a little bit if you're getting used to it, and that will happen in like 2 or 3 weeks or so. You will just zoom out quite a bit, and then you will use the slider to go in about this kind of a speed through all of your models. And then you will be like, oh yeah, cool, looks good. Actually, it doesn't on these models, but let's put that aside. You will be like, oh yeah, this looks good. I can send this off to the printer. So this doesn't add a lot to your pre-preparation stage, but this will up your print quality by quite a bit. One of the things that is sometimes talked about is printing directly on the build platform. This is nothing that we would typically recommend you doing on all your parts, but this is something that you can definitely do on some of your parts. Specifically, if you have a very nice planar surface that you can put these models on. In order for you to be printing on the build platform without any supports, for these 2 things to work, you have to meet 2 prerequisites. In order to print without any supports, your model has to be, we call it self-supporting. That means all of the layers that you're printing are supposed to be on top of what has already been printing. And for you to be printing directly on the build platform without any raft or supports, your model has to have a big enough surface area on the build platform to not rip off of the build platform during the peel process. It is very hard for me to give you like a blank recommendation. Hey, if your cross section that's building on the build platform is big enough, is X amount big enough, then it will always adhere to the build platform and it will never rip off. It highly depends on the geometry of your part and also just on the sheer size of your part in general, also on the material that you are using. Typically speaking, what I'm looking for, and this is something that the slider can help you with. So you would be looking at the first layer that you're printing at all. For this, you can use the slider. I find it a bit annoying to try and get to the first layer with this because it really locks into the space position. So here is where these page up and page down keys on your keyboard come into play, because with the page up and page down keys you will always just be jumping one individual layers. So if I'm in the base position and I just jump up one layer, I'm always in the first one. You can also see that in here. What you can also do if you're in whichever layer, you can just also click in here, just put in one, hit enter, and then you're in the first layer as well. So I'm looking at the first layer because this is what connects my model to the build platform, and I'm comparing this to the biggest cross section that I can find at some point during my print. So I would be going through here and I would be looking for the biggest cross section. So this right here might be a contender. This is getting smaller cross sections, smaller, smaller, smaller. And here it is getting bigger in cross section again. So this might also be a contender, and this is smaller again. So either this is the biggest cross section of any point during my print, or this is the biggest cross section. I would go on a limb and say this one is bigger because in here we are not missing this 3/4 of the pie that is missing on this top layer right here. Right? So this is most likely much smaller than this cross section. And right here you can see this is more of an art than actual science. Like this amount of surface area is always going to be good enough. So this is something that you will, if you do it a lot, you will get a feeling for, and you will get better at over time. At some point, if you're pushing this very far, at some point one of your prints will just detach from the build platform, and then you'll be like, oh yeah, well, okay, that was too much now. So we should go with more surface area on the build platform. So I just said I'm always comparing this first layer to the biggest cross section that I can find. Do you have any idea what's so special on this biggest cross section during our print?
No, can you explain?
Sure. So why am I looking for the largest cross section that we're printing at some point? Well, the largest cross section that we have at any given point in our model, the largest cross section of our model will be that one layer that has the highest adhesion to the bottom of the tank. So I would always be comparing the adhesion in between my model and the bottom of the tank, and my model and the build platform. And I have to make sure that the adhesion between my model and the build platform is always better than the adhesion between the model and the tank. Because if the adhesion between my model and the build platform is lower than the adhesion in between the model and the tank, when I'm trying to peel this off the bottom of the tank, well, it will just detach from the build platform and just stay at the bottom of the tank. So I will have to make sure that the model always detaches from the bottom of the tank. The cool thing about this is that our model, our resin, will cling on to the build platform much better than it does to the bottom of the tank. So that means you don't have to have your biggest cross section also be on the build platform. With this model, for example, this little rook right here, you can see that this is way smaller than this very big area right here. If you want a number, I'm really not happy with giving out numbers because, like I said, this really depends on the geometry of your part. It also depends on at what point during your print do you have this biggest cross section. But if you really want a number to just roughly adhere to, I would say look for your biggest cross section that you're printing at any given point, and make sure that at least a third of that cross section is also on the build platform. So basically, this is my biggest cross section right here, and I need to make sure that this cross section right here, this first cross section, is at least 1/3 of this biggest one. You can see just by looking at it that this is way smaller, but like I said, there's other factors that come into here, and me telling you about this like roughly a third of it is just like a very general rough number. So we just checked, okay, the model is sitting well enough on the build platform so we can print without any raft. And we need to check if our model is self-supporting. So that means everything is printing on top of each other. So nothing can hang over too far. And also we can't have anything just start out in mid-air. We would call that an island. And that is what the slider can also help us with. So I would be using the slider to just go through our part and just check if there are any parts of our model that are overhanging too far or that are starting in midair. So for this one, for example, you could say something like, oh, this is overhanging at roughly a 45-degree angle. In SLA technology, that's nothing at all. It's totally fine. We also have this Formlabs design guide online that you can find this PDF on our support pages, and there's a lot more numbers in there for like what kind of an overhang angle and what kind of a bridging can you get away with. This is also something that you will get a feeling for at some point, and then you can be very sure like, hey, just from looking at this, this is more than fine. So I'm continuously going through this model, and I would be checking for anything that prints in midair, or also big changes in cross-section. Because big changes in cross-section, something like this here, for example, always means that if we go from this layer to this next one, this means that now we have a big piece of resin that's still very thin. Remember, in the thickest of cases, we're printing in a 0.1 millimeter layer height. Most likely you're printing at 0.05 millimeters. So you have a very big piece of resin that is just overhanging in mid-air, but that is very thin and very flexible. You're pulling this off the bottom of the tank and try to not have it bend or rip. So for this one to be printed without any supports, that would be quite hard for this to print without any supports. But this piece right here, where the floor is starting, this bottom piece right here, it actually isn't printing without any supports. Because as you can see, it's supporting itself on this DNA helix that's in the middle right here. So this is a very clever idea of hiding supports in your model in the design. This is something that's a very advanced technique, and it doesn't really work on all models, and you can't just put DNA helixes everywhere. But sometimes maybe you have in your model design, if you have like an electronics enclosure and you need to have a little stem that takes basically a screw, for example, if you have like a screw stem somewhere and you have a little strut just for strength somewhere on the side, maybe you can push them into each other so that they can support each other instead of having them sit alone by each other. So this would be a model that can just be printed on a build platform, and also this is one of the models that we hand out as a sample part, so you might be familiar with this rook. So this can be very well printed on the build platform. So I've been talking about it a little bit with the rook, but basically with SLA technology, and it doesn't matter if it's a Form 2, a Form 3, or even with DLP technology, there is one thing that these kinds of printers are not good at, and it's basically that one big sin that you should never commit. And that is big jumps in cross-section, specifically going from a very small cross-section to very big cross-section. So basically in a SLA or DLP printing process, one of the worst things you could do, or basically the worst thing you could do ever, is take something like this plate, put it flat on the build platform like this, then takes the supports and have them be generated under this. Because what we would be doing right here is print these rafts on our build platform very nicely. This works very well. We're printing all of these supports, and actually in Preform, if you zoom in, you can actually see the laser path doing this perimeter on the outside twice and then going on the inside in kind of a zigzag pattern here. So, and then we would be going up, and at some point we're printing this bottom plate right here. So, just a quick question from me to you. I'm just turning this so it fits the screen a bit nicer. So, while we have our build platform and our model down in the resin, and we're currently turning on the laser module, and we're curing the individual spots of these individual supports right here. During the curing process, do you know where this, like physically in the printer, do you know where this surface area would be right now? If we're doing the curing process, where would this area be?
I have no idea.
So if you remember, one of the things that's a bit hard about Preform is that technically, and I'm just gonna put on this right here, if we have our build platform and I'm printing this little ring, let's say, it would be sitting on the build platform like this, and this is also, yeah, rings do roll, Jacob. This is also how we would be looking at it in Preform. But in reality, actually, this hangs in the printer on the build platform like this, and the ring would be upside down like this, for example. So basically in Preform, we're looking at the build platform like this, but that technically means while the printer is running, we would be more or less looking at the build platform like this in Preform. So that's why the whole thing is flipped upside down. So in Preform, this white bottom part right here that has this grid on here, this is our build platform. And all of these little surfaces right here that are being cured right now, this is basically down in the bottom of the resin tank, right? So that's always where we cure this resin. So we have all of these little points of resin with these supports. We're curing all of these one by one, right? And the LPU goes to the side. And once we've cured all of these individual points, the next thing that we do, you may remember, we just pull the build platform off, up to rip all of these off the bottom of the tank. And then we push them back down into the resin to make space for the next layer. And then we're curing all of this at the same time. And now we have this very big plate of very thin, just partially cured resin down in the tank that sits at the silicone. And on the other side, we have all of these tiny points of these support points. And we're trying to pull this up, just touching on these very tiny points. And that's where there is a certain risk of our supports either ripping off of our plate or they bend the plate at the bottom there. And this is why you would always see in our support pages and everywhere on our website or so, you will always see that these kind of models are always being printed at these kind of angles. And if you actually look into the articles on our support pages, you will usually see listed at least do a 45-degree angle on at least one axis. The 45-degree angle is not that important. It is important that you put your models on an angle at all. Because if you have this really big box and you put this on these supports, and now you have a big jump in cross-section going from the supports to this bottom plate, right? The moment you take this box and put it at any kind of an angle, instead of having this whole bottom surface be printed at once, you're starting out from a super small tiny edge, and by the time you're at some sort of a bigger cross section, you will already have been printing quite a lot of thickness to it, and it can withstand these forces during the peel process. This is way easier now on the Form 3 and it is way more forgiving than the Form 2, but this is still something you should be keeping in mind, so always try to put your models at some sort of an angle. And having talked about this now, it makes way more sense why this figurine is standing on its head. Because if we look at it at this figurine right now, with our slider we can see that the head starts printing very nicely. Then we have the neck, shoulders, arms, and then finally we print the legs and everything. Remember this self-supporting, everything can print very nicely on top of each other up until the end of the print. And you can also see that we don't need a lot of supports for this model to be printed at all. Actually, this is just a very tiny amount of supports. If I would be taking this figurine and I took this and I turned this around so that this figurine stood on its feet, I would need a lot more supports right now. Do you have any ideas where we would need a lot more supports now?
I don't see that.
So if we're printing this right now, and from the bottom to the top, there's a certain point where you can see that now these fingers are just starting out in midair to be printed. So you would actually need quite a lot of supports because these are now being printed as separate models, kind of. Like I said, we call these islands because they're just out in the middle swimming in the resin. You would need a lot more supports on these arms than much more supports than before, because now they're not printing attached to anything else. And you would very specifically need at least one support on every single one of these fingers, and then have fun taking off the supports of these fingers without damaging all of these tiny details that you might have here. This is actually something that is quite big, so it would still work very well. But if you have something that's very tiny and very highly detailed, I would always recommend trying to have it in some sort of a V or U shape so that it prints from the bottom up, or any kind of a spiral shape also typically prints very, very well. And then there's just one or two more things. We're almost done, don't worry. So I have prepared this line now for the printer. I have oriented it, I've been putting supports on it, and now I want to send this off to the printer. But there's one last thing I always do before sending my models to the printer. Do you remember what that is?
You mentioned something about checking the minimas.
Yeah, so we would be checking for minima, so you would be looking for the printability features, right? So this is something that you can use to help yourself with. So we can see right now that there are some minimas that still need supports here. So these would be basically local minimas, would also be those islands that we just spoke of. So you can check these printability features, right? But another thing that can help you with that, and something that you should always be doing before you send this off to the printer, is again using the slider to just very quickly go through your model and check it one last time. So going through this model, we actually see that there is something very specific going on with this model that we didn't have before. What's going on here with this model?
It's hollow.
Yes, so this is a hollow model, right? So let's go to support and check out what's going on here. And one of the first things you can see that there is one check mark right here for these internal supports that you can see right there. If I untick this and let Preform regenerate these supports, all of these would not be in there. So if you don't want any of the supports on the inside of your model, you just untick that check mark for internal supports. On this one, it's very easy to see these internal supports, but can you still see some of them? Even if I'm not in the sliding mode?
Yes, I can see them on the mouth.
Yes, correct. Because these right here would also be considered internal supports in our vocabulary. So basically, internal supports is everything that is going from the model to the model. So even if you have something that isn't hollow at all, this does sometimes make a difference. So let's just very quickly go over the rest of these. So we have this nice new feature in here now for Unbuild platform printing. I'm just going to show you what this looks like very quickly. I'm going to show you the edit mode in a minute, but basically what you can do is if you want this rook to be printed on the build platform without any raft or supports under the model, but you're not satisfied with how this overhang looks and you want to put on just a couple supports, what you can do is you can just click in the On-Build Platform feature, go to Edit, and then just tick in those couple supports. And if that works well, then you can see that Preform was able to put these in, and this looks more like something you would see on an FDM printer, for example. So this is a very nice feature to be used on models like these if you just have one or two overhangs, or you have a minima, but you still want to put this right on the build platform. So this is a very nice feature to be used. So going the rest of these top to bottom now. So there is first off this thing in here for the density of supports. So if I go from a density of 1.0 to 1.2 and I would click auto generate supports, what do you think would happen here?
The amount of supports will change, I guess.
Yeah, the amount of supports will change and we will get extra supports. How much more supports will we get? If you go from 1.0 to 1.2?
I really can't tell.
It's 20% extra. So that is actually pretty straightforward.
Okay.
I'm going into detail on this one so specifically And then the other way around, it's the same thing, right? So if you go down to 0.75, it's only 75% of the amount of support structures. So the structure itself is denser. It's not about the thickness of each individual support, it's about the amount of supports in general. I'm just specifically talking about how straightforward this one is because unfortunately the next one isn't so straightforward. So the touch point size basically given in millimeters right here is 0.6 millimeters. I'm gonna go into the edit mode because I can show you the touch point much easier here. And here you will see I actually have to put in this check mark for internal supports, otherwise Preform will basically tell me that these up here aren't being able to be supported. So in here we can see those touch points right there. And what we give you there is the diameter of these touch points. So the 0.6 will basically be the diameter of this ball that touches our model right here. I know this isn't always a straight circle where we touch our model. If our model has some sort of curvature to it, if we touch it with a ball, the cross section of this ball is not going to be a circle. But we ignore that for now because that's going to make my next example way more complicated. Let's assume we're touching just a straight area with our support and it's the cross section where we touch it, it's a circle. So what are our supports basically for? The supports are there to keep our model in place during the building process and to also pull them up out of the tank towards the build platform. So the supports are there to adhere to our model. And if you think about adhesion, if you think about like gluing something to something else, it's not about the diameter of that surface area that you're thinking about. I actually just spoiled already what we usually be thinking about. When we talk about adhesion or gluing something to each other, we would always be talking about the surface area. We don't really care about the diameter of that area. We care about the area itself. And that is one to one. So if you have twice the amount of surface area for gluing something together, the adhesion force in between those two will be twice as big. The problem is that we give you the diameter here. And you may remember the formula for the area of a circle is pi times r squared, or 1/4 d squared pi. But the problem is that the diameter or radius goes into that formula squared. Long story short, everything that you change in that touch point size can have drastic effects on how well these touch points adhere to your model. Because you might be thinking, oh, I'm just going down 1/6 from 0.6 to 0.5. I'm just going down 1/6 of this whole diameter. But you're not taking away 1/6 of the adhesion force. You're taking away almost, I think it amounts to 42% or something in that regard. So you're actually taking off quite a lot. So the thing I do not want you to be doing is in this base feature, go down in touch point size. In here, please leave the touch point size as is. There are a lot of people who are like, hey, I'm having trouble taking these supports off these details, these teeth right here. They always break when I take off these supports. So what I'm doing is I'm taking this down to 0.5 or 0.45, generate all the supports. And what can happen a lot of times is that the model partially or completely detaches from the supports during the print and fails. Your point is still valid though, that you would say, hey, these details, I can't take off these supports from these details. It's very hard for me to do without breaking these tiny details. What I would want you to do, leave everything here as is, let Preform generate all of these supports, and then go into the edit mode. And what you can do in the edit mode is, if you hover over your mouse over these supports, you can actually click them away. Now you can go down in touch point size to a super small one, let's say 4, 5 or 0.4 even. And then you can click in those supports onto those details again. Another thing that you can do now is you can hold left click and do a multi-selection basically of these supports and then go down in touch point size. And you will see that all of these are being scaled down at the same time. And if you hit apply on this, you will only have changed the touch points of just these supports that you just touched. All of the other ones down here are still the same nice, big and strong supports that you had before. So that's why I would always say just go down in touch point size if you're in the edit menu. You can also flip that around. So for example, if you say, hey, on this line right here, I always have to sand the bottom because it's a bit uneven, or this model, for example, doesn't even have a planar bottom surface. You would always have to sand this off to make this stand nicely on the table. So what do I care what the bottom surface looks like? I want this to be nice and stable during the print, not rip off and print very well. So what you could be doing is you could also do the reverse, go in here, and the bottom surface which you don't care about, you could go in there and say, okay, I'm going the other way around, upping my touch point, in this case from 0.6 to 0.7, adding a lot more adhesion force to our model just for free basically. And that would be how you would be changing those supports. Raft label, by the way, is just having the name of your model at the bottom here. If you want this to be changed, you could technically change the name of your STL file, but I would always advise not doing that. But clicking right click and then model properties, and in here changing the name. And then you could just say, hey, this is the left part of my housing or the top part. And you just hit enter. And even though this file is still called line_1.stl, now it says left on this bottom here, which can be quite useful. And the very last thing, we have seen that this model is hollow. So you have to remember for this model, as you're always pushing it back into a liquid resin, you have to have some sort of a drain hole. Um, and here's where it's a bit funky because a lot of people will do this wrong. A lot of people will be putting the drain hole for this line at the very top of it because they want at the end of the print for the resin that's inside to be going out. That doesn't matter at all. You can just leave that out completely. What you need to be doing though, as you're pushing this hollow model into your resin every single layer, you will have to have a little hole at the basically at the first point of your print for air and resin to go in and out for you to not be printing with a suction cup. Otherwise, what you can do is just damage your model by pushing it in, and the air that's trapped inside your vacuum here is basically trying to get out and pushing on the inside walls of your model. And then when you have printed on the next layer of resin, and if you want to pull it out, you basically, due to the vacuum that you're leaving behind, you're basically pushing the outer walls inward. So every single layer, by pushing in, you will press your model outward, and then pulling out, you will press it inward. And that can basically affect the outer and inner walls of your model to have visual defects or also fail. So you will need a suction hole like this one at the very bottom right here. And this will be definitely enough, like this one right here. Whoever made this model from the get-go wasn't really sure so in what orientation this would be printed in, so they just put a couple extra holes in here for this to be printed well. So these two are basically overkill, you don't really need them. But remember, if you do have parts that are printing as islands, like these front paws for example, as they're printing as their own suction cups, they also do need their own suction holes. So don't forget these two holes in there. What you can do with the newer versions of Preform is, if you have forgotten to make your model hollow in general, or you made your model hollow but you weren't sure about where to place your suction hole, you can just export your model as a hollow model from your CAD program, put it in Preform, do your orientation, do all of the supports, and now if you're sure about your orientation, now you will go back into your CAD program, put in a small hole for the suction, and then what you can do is you can just right click this model, hit replace, and then replace it with your new file that now does have this hole in there. And if you replace it with that new STL file, what Preform will do, it will basically put that model in the same orientation and will try to take over as many of the supports as it can. And if it can't take over all of the supports, it will give you a little error message. Let's say you have been putting a support exactly where there is now the suction hole. Obviously, Preform can't put that support there anymore, so it will give you a little warning like, hey, be careful, I wasn't able to put in all the supports where you wanted them to be. And don't forget to use the slider. I know this was quite a lot of information from the get-go. This course can be quite a bit overwhelming at first, But do take your time, just get in touch, and this is basically the second big thing. If you're ever unsure, just get in touch, send over a file, and then we're happy to just double check it, and rather than you having any failed prints or so. And the other thing, please use the slider.
Perfect. I have a question, if I may.
Sure.
Uh, are there any information online about this?
Yeah, there actually is quite a lot of information online. So you can just go to our website, formlabs.com, and on the top right, you will find the support pages. And if you go in there, there's a lot of nice articles in there. If you, for example, just put in orientation, you will find a lot more on why we will be doing these angles or what they come for. And as you might have seen in the support function that we just talked about, there's also a little bit of advanced settings at the bottom there. And if you just put in supports, you will also find explanations on all of the things that are in that advanced settings for the supports. Most likely you don't need those, but it's good to know what you have in terms of like added features in there.
Perfect. Jacob, thank you very much. This was very helpful.
Yeah, thank you for participating. And then have a good day.
Bye
Bye.
bye.